Hey everyone, go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights, find a comfortable position, and let your breathing fall into that slow, natural rhythm that tells your mind it's okay to drift a little. Tonight, we're taking a calm walk through the history surrounding one of the most recited, most loved verses in the entire Islamic tradition, Ayat al-Kursi. Not through argument and debate, not through loud emotion or theology battles, but through quiet context, through the world that lived around it, through the people who memorized it, wrote it down, carried it from place to place, and treated it as something worth preserving across 14 centuries of human life. This isn't a lecture to shake you awake. It's a slow, steady narration designed to help your mind relax while you slowly absorb the story of a verse that millions whisper every night before sleep. So, let's let the day unwind a little, and begin. We start in a world that was both familiar and distant, a world of warm nights and cold deserts, a world where most people lived with simple routines, a handful of possessions, predictable seasons, and quiet evenings lit by fire or moonlight. It was the 7th century Arabian Peninsula, and despite what movies sometimes show, it wasn't all endless battles and dramatic horse chases. Most of the time, it was ordinary life. Families preparing food, merchants closing their stalls, shepherds calling animals home before the desert temperature dropped, and travelers sitting around small fires because the silence of the night was too large to sit in alone. The city of Medina, which would become the home of the verse we're talking about, was growing and changing in ways that seemed almost impossible compared to the lives people had lived just years earlier. Tribes that had held grudges for generations were trying, slowly and imperfectly, to live as neighbors instead of rivals. Former enemies were praying side by side. People were forming a community that wasn't based only on bloodline or trade alliances, but on a shared belief that tied them together in a new way. At the center of this community was the Prophet Muhammad, a man whose daily life was simpler than the political changes swirling around him. His home was small. His routines were consistent. The people who gathered around him weren't elites or royalty. They were farmers, shepherds, merchants, freed slaves, and a few who had once held authority but had set it aside to be part of something they didn't fully understand yet, but believed in anyway. And in the midst of all of this, the building of a new society, the learning, the teaching, the nightly conversations that stretched into the calm hours. The Qur'an was being revealed slowly, piece by piece, verse by verse, not in large, dramatic moments, but in steady ones, sometimes during gatherings, sometimes during travel, sometimes in the quiet of the night. Ayat al-Kursi belongs to that world. Before we explore its history, its context, and how it became one of the most memorized verses in the world, it helps to picture the setting where it first entered human speech. Imagine a home built from simple materials, with floors smoothed by years of footsteps. Imagine a lamp lit with oil, giving off a soft glow that made shadows wobble gently on the walls. Imagine companions sitting close by, listening carefully, because every new verse of the Qur'an wasn't just information. It was guidance, it was reassurance, it was something that shaped how they understood the world, themselves, and their Creator. The verse speaks about Allah's eternal life, His knowledge, His authority, His guardianship. The language is structured, balanced, and complete in a way that made it stand out even among other verses, which already had a profound rhythm of their own. Early Muslims didn't need linguistic analysis to feel something special in it. The sound alone gave a sense of grandeur. And yet, when it was first recited, there were no calligraphers leaning over parchment, no decorated manuscripts, no carved inscriptions, no hanging plaques, or golden embroidery, or printed pocket-sized booklets. There was only recitation, a voice in a room. A verse entering the memory of those present, a moment that would echo far beyond the quiet of that night. The companions often described revelation not as something explosive or dramatic, but as something weighty, something that settled into the space around them, something that made the room feel still for a moment, even if the world outside wasn't. Ayat al-Kursi came during a period when many of the longest chapters of the Qur'an were being completed. The Muslim community was dealing with new laws, new expectations, and new social realities. People had questions. They were learning how to build a functioning society while also trying to change their personal habits, their attitudes, and their understanding of right and wrong. So a verse that described the sovereignty of Allah, His limitless knowledge, and the expansiveness of His throne wasn't just theology. It was grounding. It was something that put everything else, political tension, tribal rivalry, personal fear, uncertainty about the future, into perspective. When you see it through that lens, the verse stops being an isolated piece of text and becomes part of the narrative of a community trying to stabilize itself spiritually, socially, and mentally. But let's continue settling into the setting before we move forward. The early Muslims didn't think of their daily lives as history. They didn't picture their conversations being studied 1,000 years later. They weren't imagining manuscripts written in Spain, or scholars in Persia debating grammatical nuances, or rulers in North Africa commissioning massive mosques where the verse would be carved into stone. For them, it was simply guidance given during a time of change. And every time a verse was revealed, scribes would quietly step forward when needed. Some wrote on parchment, some on leather, some on flat pieces of bone or thin wooden tablets. Not every piece survived, not every material was durable, but the primary way the Qur'an spread, the way Ayat al-Kursi spread, was through recitation and memory. The verse was carried in hearts first, pages only came later. This is something people often forget when imagining early Islamic history. They picture neat books lined on shelves or polished calligraphy covers. But these things came centuries later, after dynasties had risen and fallen, after trade routes connected the Muslim world with China, Africa, and Europe, and after entire intellectual centers developed places like Baghdad, Samarkand, Kairwan, and Cairo. But for the first generation, for the people who heard Ayat al-Kursi before anyone else, it was simply recited, not framed, not engraved, not decorated, just spoken. There's something calming about that idea. A verse that would travel across continents and centuries began as a quiet sound in a simple room. So as the night deepens and you settle even more, imagine how it must have felt to hear it for the first time, to listen to words that expressed the absolute majesty of Allah, while sitting in a space that was humble, quiet, and small. That contrast is part of what made the verse unforgettable. Over time, it became one of the most recited verses in daily Muslim life, something whispered before sleep, something recited for comfort, something parents taught their children as one of the earliest pieces of Qur'an to memorize. But we're not rushing there yet. History is calmer when we let it unfold slowly. Before we get into manuscripts, scholars, dynasties, and cultural traditions, we're going to stay in this early setting just a little longer, because understanding the world where Ayat al-Kursi first appeared helps us understand why it meant so much to the people who heard it. Medina at night had a different rhythm than cities today. There were no electric lights, no traffic, no noise from screens, cars, or machinery. The soundscape was mostly wind, footsteps, low voices, and the occasional call of an animal. Homes weren't tightly sealed, so moonlight filtered through small openings, and the cool desert air drifted indoors. People often gathered together in the evenings to discuss their day, ask questions, or simply sit in companionable silence. Revelation didn't come at predictable hours. It didn't arrive according to a human schedule, so people were always ready, always attentive, always prepared to receive something that might reshape their understanding. And the verse we're refocusing on tonight, Ayat al-Kursi, is one of the most expansive expressions of divine authority in the whole Qur'an. But the remarkable thing is how it entered the world so quietly. No ceremony, no proclamation, no dramatic build-up, just calm, steady recitation. As you breathe deeper and your body sinks into the comfort of your space, picture that gentle moment. A small home, a handful of companions, a lamp glowing, a verse being recited for the first time, and the room becoming still as its words filled the air. In that stillness lived the beginning of a legacy that would last more than a millennium. You can stay just as you are, settled, breathing slow, letting the day fade into the background. Part 2 picks up the verse as it begins to move outward from that small, quiet room in Medina and into the wider world of early Islam. And the first place it traveled wasn't far at all. It moved into the memories of the companions. For the earliest Muslim community, memorization wasn't a difficult academic task. It was simply how people lived. The culture of Arabia was built on poetry, oral storytelling, genealogies, and long recitations that passed from one generation to the next without written reference. It was a world where a person's memory functioned like a personal library. People stored line after line, story after story, without thinking of it as unusual. So when Ayat al-Kursi was revealed, it didn't take long before the companions carried it with them in their voices. They recited it during prayer. They taught it to their families. They repeated it during long travels across the desert. Some whispered it before sleep. Some used it as a way to calm their hearts in moments of uncertainty. There was no ritual attached yet, at least not in the way later communities would formalize it. It was simply a verse they loved, and love spreads quickly. The more the companions heard it, the more they retained it. And the more they retained it, the more it became woven into the daily rhythm of the community. It is easy to imagine someone sitting in the shade of a palm tree during the heat of the afternoon, softly reciting the verse by themselves just to let the sound settle in their mind, or a traveler repeating it in the early morning before setting off toward Mecca or the markets of Syria. But as Medina grew and the Muslim community expanded, the verse began to travel farther, not because of written pages, but because of people. There's a particular simplicity to those early years. Most of the companions weren't scribes, most weren't officials, most weren't wealthy or influential. They were ordinary individuals who believed they had been given something worth preserving, and the easiest way to preserve it was through their own voices. This is the beginning of what later became one of the most remarkable features of Islamic history, the transmission of the Qur'an through mass memorization long before it existed as a complete written book. Ayat al-Kursi lived in that early organic flow of memory. As more people converted, the verse spread with them. Traders carried it along routes that connected Medina with the Red Sea coast. Visitors returned to their tribes with new teachings, including fragments of the Qur'an that they found especially powerful. Some recited the verse during prayer gatherings. Some shared it in personal conversations. The verse slowly found its way into the minds of people far beyond the walls of Medina. And as it spread, something subtle began to happen. Certain verses gained special affection among the early Muslims, not because someone ranked them, but because some verses touched people's hearts in a way that felt comforting and stabilizing. Ayat al-Kursi was one of them. It spoke about Allah's eternal life, His knowledge, His authority, His guardianship, and it did so in a way that was complete, balanced, and calming. People gravitated toward it the way someone today might gravitate toward a favorite line of poetry or a familiar prayer. It became a piece of spiritual grounding, a sense of reassurance in a world that was still changing rapidly. By this time, Medina was becoming the heart of a new social structure. Conflicts had decreased, trade was growing, new families were forming, and the city was turning into a center of learning, even if that learning was still mostly oral. Scribes continued to write verses whenever the Prophet instructed them to, but the preservation of the Qur'an was not done through official institutions yet. There was no Qur'an office, no standardized manuscript, no printing press, no binding. What existed was a community that carried verses in their minds, reciting them during prayer in consistent patterns, and those recitations created a natural system of verification. If someone recited something incorrectly, others would correct them. If a small detail slipped from memory, someone else would restore it. This collective preservation is how verses like Ayat al-Kursi remained intact. Now, let's float ahead a little, not rushing, just drifting into the period right after the Prophet's death. This was when the Muslim world was facing uncertainty. The unity created in Medina was under strain. Tribes across Arabia were reconsidering their alliances. Leaders were trying to keep the community intact. And the Qur'an, which had been preserved in memory, suddenly needed extra protection, not because it was disappearing, but because the lives of those who memorized large portions of it were now in danger. Many of them had to fight in early conflicts, and there were fears that if too many died before teaching others, parts of the Qur'an could be lost. This concern is what eventually led to the first major written compilation of the Qur'an during the Caliphate of Abu Bakr. The process wasn't rushed. It wasn't political. It wasn't designed to alter the text. It was an effort to collect and preserve what was already widely known and recited. Ayat al-Kursi, like all other verses, was verified through multiple reciters, written fragments, and cross-checking with those who memorized large portions. By the time the compilation was done, the verse had already been established across the community, and its wording was firmly fixed. A few years later, under Caliph Uthman, additional copies were created and standardized to ensure unity across the growing Muslim world. These copies traveled to major cities, Mecca, Basra, Kufa, Damascus, marking the first time the verse existed in a consistent written format across multiple regions. From here, the verse's journey shifted into a new phase. Now it wasn't only traveling through people. It was traveling through manuscripts, and manuscripts in the early Islamic world were created in quiet libraries by professional scribes wearing neat robes. They were made by ordinary individuals, some trained, some untrained, using ink made from soot and natural oils, writing on parchment or thin animal skin. The earliest Quranic manuscripts often looked simple: large letters, minimal decoration, no detailed borders, no artistic flourishes, but the simplicity had a certain beauty. Each stroke of the pen was deliberate. Each word was written with intention, and Ayat al-Kursi appeared in early manuscripts with a clarity that reflected the importance people attached to it. Now, as centuries moved on, something interesting happened. Islamic calligraphy evolved, and with it, the way people honored certain verses changed. New scripts emerged: Kufic, Naskh, Thuluth. Emperors, sultans, and rulers commissioned large Qur'ans with decorated openings. Gold leaf, intricate borders, and precise geometry became part of the tradition, and while entire chapters were often decorated, certain verses received extra attention. Ayat al-Kursi was one of them. Across the Muslim world, from Spain in the west to Persia in the east, scribes and artists created beautiful renditions of this single verse. Some hung it inside mosques, some inscribed it on walls, some wrote it inside small protective cases people carried with them. Over time, it became one of the most visually represented verses of the entire Qur'an. But before we drift too far into later centuries, let's return to the early period for a moment, because the verse had another development happening alongside its preservation. It began to shape early Islamic teaching. Companions taught the verse not only for its meaning, but for the comfort and reassurance it offered. Some recited it at night as a way to feel protected. Some used it in personal prayers. Some simply found peace in repeating it softly before sleep. By the time the second and third generations of Muslims emerged, the generation of the students of the companions, and the students of those students, Ayat al-Kursi already had a reputation as a beloved verse, not because of legends or stories, but because its content resonated deeply with the way people understood God's authority and mercy. And this is where early Muslim scholars enter the story. They began to write explanations, tafsir, for various verses of the Qur'an. When they reached Ayat al-Kursi, they spent long pages explaining its phrases, its structure, and its meaning. They discussed how the verse described Allah's attributes in a concise yet expansive way. They examined the grammar, the rhythm, the choice of words. Some scholars noted that the verse seemed to flow from one idea to the next, with a balance that made it feel complete on its own. Others observed that it contained a summary of themes that appeared throughout the Qur'an: life, knowledge, authority, guardianship, and the throne. The throne al-Kursi became a subject of deep reflection, not in a speculative or imaginative way, but in a way that emphasized Allah's greatness beyond human comprehension. As these scholars traveled, teaching in mosques, leading sessions in markets, mentoring students under the shade of trees, their explanations spread, and with them, the verse grew even more deeply rooted in Muslim learning. By now, Ayat al-Kursi wasn't only a verse people had memorized. It was part of a shared intellectual and spiritual culture. Keep your breathing steady, let the room stay quiet, and picture the world shifting gently beneath the narrative as we move from early Medina into the growing intellectual landscape of the Muslim world. Ayat al-Kursi was no longer just a verse recited in homes and small gatherings. By the time a few decades had passed, it was already resting inside the hearts of thousands. Merchants knew it, travelers knew it, children learned it before they learned many other verses. And now, with the Qur'an compiled and copies sent to major cities, the verse had entered a new phase of its story, the era of scholars. Let's float into the world of early Islamic scholarship, a world that didn't look like modern universities. There were no lecture halls, no textbooks, no standardized exams. The closest thing to a library was usually a cluster of people, sitting in a circle under a tree or in the courtyard of a mosque, listening to a teacher speak slowly while scribes copied notes onto parchment. This was knowledge at ground level, warm, human, passed from voice to voice more than from page to page. And in this world, Ayat al-Kursi grew into one of the most discussed verses in the Qur'an. The earliest scholars, people like Ibn Abbas, Ibn Madad, and others, taught that the verse represented one of the most complete descriptions of Allah's sovereignty. Their students wrote these explanations down, often on small scraps of parchment. which were later collected into early books of tafsir. Those books didn't look like the thick volumes you might see today. They were simple, often incomplete, sometimes written in rough handwriting, sometimes missing pages because the author had run out of material, or because insects decided the manuscript was a snack. But the heart of the content remained intact, and Ayat al-Kursi always took up more space than most verses around it. This is where we meet the early centers of learning, places that would shape Islamic history for centuries. Kufa, the city of reciters. Our first stop is Kufa, a city in Iraq that quickly became known for its powerful tradition of Quranic recitation. If Medina was the birthplace of revelation and Mecca was the sacred center, Kufa became the place where recitation styles were refined, taught, and transmitted. The teachers in Kufa were known for their careful attention to detail. They memorized the Qur'an with precision, and their students became some of the most well-known reciters in history. And guess which verse reciters spent extra time on? Ayat al-Kursi. Its balanced structure, the way one phrase leads gently into the next, made it a favorite for those who took pride in perfecting their delivery. Basra, the city of grammar not far from Kufa, was Basra, the city that would give the world early Arabic grammar. Basran scholars were obsessed, lovingly, with the structure of the language. They studied letters, sounds, patterns, roots, and they sometimes wrote entire treatises on a single verse. Ayat al-Kursi, with its rhythmic precision and carefully chosen vocabulary, became a prime example of the Qur'an's linguistic mastery. Scholars debated the fine points of its grammar in long sessions that probably stretched from afternoon into night. Students sat quietly, writing down explanations with ink made from soot and gum, knowing these lessons would outlive them. Damascus, the city of early books. If we drift northwest, we reach Damascus, one of the world's most beautiful cities at the time. The Umayyad rulers made it their capital, and with their wealth came new opportunities for scholarship. It was here that early manuscripts began to take shape, real, organized books with coherent structure. Scholars recorded hadith, jurisprudence, history, and tafsir, and among the many subjects written about Ayat al-Kursi stood out. Damascus had some of the earliest schools where children learned the Qur'an from teachers who belonged to long chains of recitation. Every teacher could trace their knowledge back to the companions. Every student recited the verse dozens of times before memorizing even half of the Qur'an. By this point, the verse wasn't only remembered, it was honored. Baghdad, the city of knowledge. But if we follow the flow of time a bit further, we reach the city that transformed everything. Baghdad. Founded in the 8th century, Baghdad grew into one of the greatest intellectual centers in human history. Scholars traveled from across the Muslim world to study there. Philosophers debated Greek texts. Astronomers built observatories. Mathematicians created new systems of calculation. Doctors wrote medical encyclopedias that would later influence Europe. And in the middle of all this knowledge, Quranic studies remained the heart of intellectual life. Baghdad scholars didn't treat Ayat al-Kursi as a simple verse. They treated it with a kind of reverence that made it central to many discussions. Theologians wrote about the meanings of the divine attributes mentioned in the verse. Commentators analyzed its structure, pointing out how each phrase mirrors another. Philosophers admired its depth, noting how it expressed profound truths with remarkable clarity. In Baghdad, sessions of tafsir often lasted hours. Students sat in long rows, writing carefully while the teacher explained the verse word by word. Ayat al-Kursi could take days to cover. This wasn't boredom, it was devotion. Knowledge in that era wasn't rushed. People didn't skim, they absorbed slowly. The verse in travel. Now imagine caravans traveling across deserts. Imagine boats crossing the Red Sea, carrying merchants toward the coast of East Africa. Imagine scholars journeying from Baghdad to Cairo, from Damascus to Jerusalem, from Medina to Yemen. These travelers carried luggage, supplies, trade goods, and a verse they loved to recite at night. Ayat al-Kursi became a companion for travelers. For many, it was the last verse they recited before sleeping beside a campfire. For others, it was a source of calm during long journeys through unfamiliar land. And as it traveled, it found new homes. North Africa and the Maghreb. In North Africa, cities like Kairouan and Fez emerged as centers of learning. Students gathered in mosques where light filtered through ancient windows and cast gentle shadows on the stone floors. Teachers here developed strong traditions of memorization, Their students recited Ayat al-Kursi repeatedly as part of early lessons, often writing the verse on wooden tablets with erasable ink so they could wash and reuse them. Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain. Then there was Al-Andalus, the Muslim territory in the Iberian Peninsula. Its scholars produced some of the most refined Quranic manuscripts in history. Thick pages, golden borders, careful lines, elegant scripts that took months to complete. Ayat al-Kursi was often given full-page treatment. In some Andalusian manuscripts, the verse appears in shimmering gold ink, surrounded by delicate geometric patterns. These weren't just religious texts, they were works of art, and the verse was always placed in a way that emphasized its beauty and importance. Persia and Central Asia. Farther east, in Persia and Central Asia, scholars developed commentary traditions that blended linguistic analysis with philosophical reflection. Cities like Nishapur, Samarkand, and Bukhara became home to great libraries. Students copied tafsir by hand under dim lamps. Ink froze in winter, so scribes warmed it over small fires. Books were wrapped in cloth to protect them from dust, and Ayat al-Kursi appeared in almost every commentary, sometimes receiving multi-page explanations. In these lands, the verse also entered decorative arts. People carved it into architecture, etched it onto metalwork, embroidered it into textiles, and wove it into carpets that adorned mosques and homes. And slowly, across centuries, Ayat al-Kursi evolved from a recited verse into a cultural symbol, a symbol of protection, a symbol of divine authority, a symbol of spiritual comfort. As the night deepens, our attention returns to the words of Ayat al-Kursi and what they meant to the earliest believers who heard them for the first time. They lived in a world where danger and uncertainty were familiar companions. Travel was risky, homes were simple, and the desert could turn harsh without warning. Yet this single verse became a source of quiet strength for them, a reminder that they were never alone. The verse describes Allah as the one who never grows tired and never sleeps. This idea reshaped how people understood protection. Human guards can drift off, kings can be occupied or distracted, even the strongest warrior can fail. But the one who created the heavens and the earth does not rest, does not weaken, and does not forget. The companions said that Ayat al-Kursi felt like a shield, not a shield held in the hand, but one placed around the heart. They believed that when a person recited it before sleeping, a guard from the angels stayed near them until dawn. This thought helped them fall asleep peacefully, even when the night was cold or the camp was surrounded by silence. The words, "His Kursi extends over the heavens and the earth," were especially powerful. Many tried to imagine it, but the scholars explained that the true nature of the Kursi is beyond human understanding. Still, the idea helped people feel the scale of creation. It made their own worries seem small, and it opened a sense of wonder about the world they lived in. As the verse continues, it reminds us that knowledge itself belongs to Allah. We only know what He allows us to know. This line has been discussed for centuries. Some said it explains why science progresses slowly over time. Others said it describes the limits of human thought, no matter how intelligent we become. For the early Muslims, it simply meant humility. They understood that being human meant accepting the boundaries of the mind. By the end of the verse, the message becomes clear. Allah's power, His knowledge, His presence, and His throne are unlike anything we can imagine. Yet the verse is spoken with gentleness, not force. It does not frighten, it comforts. It teaches that the one who created all things is also the one who watches over every moment. And so, as generations passed, Ayat al-Kursi stayed close to the hearts of believers. It was recited during travel, before sleep, after prayers, and in moments of fear. It became a companion to the tired, the worried, and the hopeful. Even now, in a world buzzing with technology and constant movement, the verse carries the same calm strength. When we listen to it slowly, the mind settles. The noise of the day begins to fade, and the old companions of Prophet Muhammad, who once listened to it under the desert sky, feel a little closer to us. As we move deeper into the story of Ayat al-Kursi, it helps to imagine how the early community received this verse. Before Islam, people in Arabia held many beliefs about spirits, protection, and unseen forces. Some wore charms, others relied on poets or tribal leaders for blessings. Fear of the unknown shaped much of their daily life. When Ayat al-Kursi was revealed, it gently replaced those fears with certainty. It taught that nothing in the heavens or the earth moves except by Allah's will. This idea slowly changed the way people looked at their surroundings, the wind, the night, the distant sounds of animals, and even moments of silence felt different. They understood that the world was not controlled by chance. There was order, wisdom, and purpose behind every moment. The verse also offered something the people had never heard described in this way: the reality of Allah's throne. The scholars explained that the throne is not like anything in creation. It is not a symbol. It is a real creation known only to Allah, and it represents His absolute authority. For the early Muslims, this was a new and powerful concept. It helped them draw a line between the Creator and everything else. They learned that Allah's throne includes all that exists. No kingdom, no tribe, no world, and no star stands outside His reach. This brought calm to those who worried about the future. When a person knows that everything is held by one power, it becomes easier to breathe, easier to accept, and easier to trust. In gatherings, elders would recite Ayat al-Kursi with a slow and steady voice. Children listened first for the melody, then for the meaning as they grew older. Many of them could not read, but they memorized this verse before anything else. They carried it through deserts, over mountains, and into new lands as Islam spread. What stood out most to them was the line that says, "Preserving them does not tire Him." Two people who worked long days under the sun. This line was especially meaningful. They knew what it felt like to be exhausted. They knew the weight of responsibility. But this verse told them that Allah carries the entire creation without effort. They took comfort in that. It reminded them that even when they felt weak, they were still under the care of a power that never weakens. Centuries later, these reflections became part of Islamic teaching. Scholars wrote long explanations. Students repeated them in quiet classrooms. Travelers took them across oceans. Still, the message stayed the same. Ayat al-Kursi is a verse of protection, knowledge, and reassurance. It speaks to every generation, no matter how much the world changes. As you listen to it now, it works in the same way it did for those who lived long ago. It slows the thoughts, eases the mind, and brings a feeling of being watched over. The verse does not promise a life without difficulty, but it reminds us that no difficulty is greater than the one who created life itself. The night continues, the world softens, and the story of this verse carries you a little deeper into Let's drift a little further into the journey of Ayat al-Kursi, as it moved from homes and classrooms into the wider culture of the Muslim world. After its recitation and memorization spread across Arabia, the verse slowly became part of daily life in every community that embraced Islam. In North Africa, families recited it before sleep. In Persia, students repeated it aloud under the careful eyes of teachers. In Andalusia, artisans included it in the intricate designs of tiles, metalwork, and manuscripts. The verse, in a quiet way, began to shape routines. It wasn't loud or demanding. It didn't require grand ceremonies. Instead, it appeared in the soft rhythms of daily devotion, whispered before bed, repeated during travel, and recited during prayer. Even kings and rulers, while busy with courts, taxes, and politics, made sure the verse was present in their lives. Some commissioned beautifully written copies for mosques. Others had small personal manuscripts to read privately. The verse became a thread linking people of all social classes, from shepherds in the desert to scholars in grand cities. Early scholars also explored its deeper meanings. They discussed the nature of Allah's throne, the infinite reach of His knowledge, and the assurance that nothing happens without His will. Each generation of teachers passed down these insights to students, who would then recite them in quiet rooms, under trees, or in the halls of learning. An interesting aspect of Ayat al-Kursi's presence in daily life was its association with protection. The companions and early Muslims believed that reciting it before sleep offered a kind of spiritual safeguard, not because it magically changed the world, but because it reminded the believer that they were under the care of a power far greater than any human concern. That reminder, repeated night after night, brought peace and calm. This pattern continued as Islam spread east and west. In Baghdad, it became part of the curriculum in study circles. In Egypt, families included it in personal prayer routines. In India, teachers used it to introduce children to memorization of the Qur'an. And in each region, it retained the same gentle authority, spoken, memorized, and felt deeply, rather than displayed as a spectacle. As the centuries moved on, Ayat al-Kursi also entered art and architecture. Scholars and artisans alike sought to honor the verse visually, without distracting from its message. In mosques, it was inscribed above arches or along walls, written in elegant calligraphy that reflected the care and reverence given to the words. In manuscripts, it often received special attention, sometimes written in gold or decorated with delicate patterns, distinguishing it from other verses while preserving the same meaning. The verse's journey, however, was not limited to the classroom, the home, or the mosque. Travelers carried it across continents, whispered it quietly by candlelight in tents, and recited it during journeys that could be long and uncertain. Ayat al-Kursi became more than a verse. It became a companion, a constant presence in moments of transition and uncertainty. Even today, the verse holds that same gentle authority. Millions around the world recite it daily. They do so in private moments, in families, before sleep, or as a source of comfort during challenging times. Its meaning, preserved over centuries, still speaks to the human need for protection, reassurance, and understanding of the divine order. And so, as you continue to relax, it's worth imagining the countless quiet nights across centuries when Ayat al-Kursi was whispered in homes, study circles, and tents. Each recitation linked people together across time, creating a calm thread through the chaos of human life. The verse is a quiet presence, much like this story, gentle, continuous, and comforting. Now, as the story drifts forward, let us settle into the period when Ayat al-Kursi became not only a spiritual guide, but also a central part of education, scholarship, and culture across the Islamic world. By the 10th and 11th centuries, large centers of learning had developed across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. Cities like Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, Kairouan, and Nishapur were home to scholars who taught not only law and theology, but also grammar, poetry, and philosophy. In each of these centers, Ayat al-Kursi was carefully studied, discussed, and memorized. Students, often young and wide-eyed, learned the verse first because of its spiritual significance, and later because it offered a model of eloquence and clarity. Teachers explained the structure of the verse, noting how each phrase flowed into the next, how the meaning unfolded with precision, and how the words conveyed both authority and mercy. One of the fascinating things about Ayat al-Kursi is how it combines depth with simplicity. The imagery of the throne, the description of divine knowledge, and the reassurance of constant guardianship create a calm certainty in the listener or reader. Scholars pointed this out, highlighting that the verse could be appreciated by both the young and the learned. A child could memorize it, while a scholar could spend hours reflecting on its meaning. Meanwhile, the verse began to appear in other forms of cultural expression. Artisans inscribed it on pottery, metalwork, and wood. In mosques, calligraphers decorated domes and walls with flowing letters that drew the eye upward, encouraging contemplation. Manuscripts were carefully copied, sometimes adorned with gold, sometimes marked with decorative borders, but always preserving the original wording. It's worth pausing to imagine this. A scribe hunched over a parchment in the warm light of a lantern, the tip of the reed pen moving slowly, deliberately, as every curve of the letter forms the verse perfectly. Outside, the city is quiet. Only the wind through the trees or the occasional footstep disturbs the stillness. The act of writing Ayat al-Kursi becomes, in itself, a meditative practice. As Islam spread into new lands, the verse traveled with it. In Persia and Central Asia, it was included in study circles, often recited in the evening as part of memorization practice. In North Africa, families incorporated it into daily routines, repeating it softly before sleep or after prayers. And in Al-Andalus, scholars and artists created some of the most beautiful manuscripts and decorative inscriptions known in the medieval world, highlighting the verse in ways that honored both its meaning and its form. The verse also influenced the practice of devotion. Recitation before sleep, during travel, and in times of worry became common. It was not considered magical, but it served as a source of focus and reassurance. When a person repeated the words of the verse, they were reminded of the constant presence of Allah, the scope of His knowledge, and the security of His guardianship. It is fascinating to think that, centuries before modern books, printing presses, or digital copies, this verse was preserved in hearts, in whispers, in careful writing, and in shared study. Each generation learned it from the previous one, adding layers of reflection, commentary, and cultural significance, without changing a single word. By this time, Ayat al-Kursi had established itself as a cornerstone of Islamic spiritual life. It was memorized first by children, taught in schools, recited in homes, and revered in scholarly works. Its influence extended beyond personal devotion. It became a symbol of continuity, of careful preservation, and of the human connection to the divine. As the centuries progressed, the verse continued to travel alongside human movement. Traders took it across deserts and seas. Pilgrims carried it to holy sites. Scholars included it in correspondence. And in every place, it retained its calm authority, gently reminding people of the order, protection, and knowledge of Allah. Even today, millions of Muslims recite Ayat al-Kursi daily. They do so in private moments, in family gatherings, or during prayer. Its words continue to offer comfort and clarity, just as they did over 1,000 years ago. And now, as your mind relaxes further, imagine all the countless nights across history where the verse was whispered in homes, study circles, and mosques, a quiet, steady presence linking human hearts across generations. Each recitation, gentle and deliberate, formed an invisible thread connecting people to one another and to the divine. In this way, Ayat al-Kursi is more than a verse. It is a companion. It is a source of comfort. It is a quiet, enduring reminder that, amid uncertainty, there is an order, a knowledge, and a presence that is constant and reassuring. Now, let's continue drifting gently through time, into the ways Ayat al-Kursi became part of everyday life, art, and culture, not just memorization and scholarship. By the medieval period, the verse was firmly established in both personal devotion and public spaces. People didn't only recite it quietly before sleep. They began to honor it visually, integrating it into homes, mosques, schools, and public buildings. It wasn't decoration for decoration's sake. Every stroke, every curve of the letters reflected reverence and care, reminding people of the meaning behind the words, even before they recited them. Imagine walking into a mosque in Cairo or Damascus in the 12th century. Light filters through intricately carved wooden screens, softening the room. Along the walls, Ayat al-Kursi is inscribed in elegant Kufic or Naskh script. The letters seem to float, guiding the eyes upward and giving a sense of calm. Visitors who cannot yet read the verse understand it through repetition and memorization, hearing it during prayer, seeing it in art, and sensing its presence. In Andalusia, calligraphers and artists took the verse a step further. Manuscripts were created with lavish gold leaf, delicate geometric patterns, and vibrant colors. Some copies featured Ayat al-Kursi on a full page, giving it a prominence that reflected its spiritual and cultural significance. People who saw these manuscripts didn't need to open the book to feel the power of the verse. Its presence alone was enough to inspire calm, reflection, and reverence. Meanwhile, in Persia and Central Asia, Ayat al-Kursi entered the worlds of textiles, metalwork, and ceramics. Rugs were woven with subtle representations of the verse along the borders. Doors, window frames, and gates were engraved with carefully designed calligraphy. Metal bowls, incense burners, and other household items often carried the verse in small, elegant inscriptions. Each item became a reminder of divine oversight, and in this way, Ayat al-Kursi became part of daily life without anyone needing to recite it aloud. One interesting development was the use of the verse for protection. Families placed inscriptions of Ayat al-Kursi near entrances, windows, or over sleeping areas. Travelers carried small written copies tucked into their bags or pouches. It was not superstition, it was remembrance. The verse itself was a source of mindfulness and reassurance. Each recitation or visible inscription encouraged the believer to reflect quietly on divine protection and knowledge. As centuries passed, scholars wrote further commentary, expanding upon earlier texts. They explored the meanings of each phrase, the balance of language, and the significance of the throne. Teachers included the verse as a starting point in Quranic education. Students learned it first, not because it was easier than other verses, but because it captured the essence of divine majesty, authority and mercy in a way that was both simple to memorize and deep enough to contemplate for a lifetime. Ayat al-Kursi also became central in oral culture. Storytellers and religious teachers recited it at gatherings, often in the evenings when families or communities assembled. Its rhythm and cadence created a calming atmosphere, drawing listeners into a reflective state. Scholars noted that even those unfamiliar with Arabic could sense the serenity embedded in its words when recited properly. The verse's influence even extended into the everyday rhythms of life. Parents taught it to children, travelers recited it in tents, artisans included it in works of craftsmanship, and worshippers repeated it during prayer. Across continents, from the deserts of Arabia to the cities of North Africa, Persia, and Al-Andalus, it became a shared thread that linked communities together. Through all of this, the verse remained consistent. The wording did not change. The meaning did not shift. What did change was the way people engaged with it, and the quiet cultural imprint it left on the world. Even now, as you breathe slowly and relax further, it's possible to imagine this continuity. Picture centuries of quiet recitation, in homes by lantern light, under the open sky, in mosques with patterned floors, in classrooms with students leaning over wooden tablets. Each repetition, each whisper, carried the same reassurance and calm, preserving both the words and the spirit behind them. Ayat al-Kursi's journey, from early Medina to the far reaches of the Islamic world, is a story of patience, devotion, and continuity. It reminds us that sometimes the most profound influence is quiet, subtle, and persistent. Over centuries, this single verse shaped not only spiritual practice but also art, scholarship, and daily life. Let's drift into the quiet ways. Ayat al-Kursi became part of personal devotion and daily life. Beyond scholarship, manuscripts, and art, the verse settled into the rhythms of everyday existence, offering reassurance and a gentle sense of protection. Early Muslims discovered that reciting Ayat al-Kursi could accompany almost any daily activity. Before sleep, it became a natural practice, whispered softly as the day ended. Travelers recited it before setting out on long journeys, finding comfort in the knowledge that the Creator watches over everything, everywhere. Children memorized it first, among all other verses, embedding a lifelong connection to its rhythm and meaning. The verse also became linked to protection. People placed small written copies near doors, windows, and sleeping areas. Travelers carried them tucked in their garments or bags. These were not charms in a superstitious sense. They were reminders, prompts, to reflect on the presence and knowledge of Allah. The verse itself was enough to encourage mindfulness, calm, and spiritual focus. In homes, it was often recited after daily prayers, a soft bridge between ritual and reflection. Families would gather, children leaning quietly against parents, listening to the verse, letting the cadence settle the mind. Scholars emphasized the psychological as well as spiritual benefits, noting that repeated reflection on divine knowledge and authority naturally reduced anxiety and fear. In addition to personal practice, Ayat al-Kursi influenced ritual life. Over the centuries, it became common to recite the verse after obligatory prayers, during moments of need, and at times of reflection. People would repeat it multiple times a day, each recitation reinforcing a sense of spiritual calm. By doing so, the verse became not only memorized, but also lived, felt, and experienced. Across regions, from North Africa to Persia, the verse was integrated into both the private and public spheres. In mosques, it was sometimes recited in group gatherings, creating a communal atmosphere of reassurance and reflection. During education sessions, students learned it first, not only for memorization but to understand the qualities of divine guardianship, knowledge, and authority embedded in the words. Even craftsmen, while working on daily tasks, might recite or hum the verse quietly, creating an invisible rhythm that accompanied their labor. Its presence was subtle but persistent, reinforcing spiritual awareness in everyday actions. In this way, Ayat al-Kursi shaped the flow of life, linking ordinary moments with reflection on the divine. By the later centuries, these practices had become standardized in many communities. Families taught children to recite the verse at specific times of day. Travelers carried it as part of their spiritual preparation. Scholars included it in morning and evening recitations, and across continents, the verse became a constant companion, quietly anchoring the spiritual lives of countless individuals. The enduring impact of Ayat al-Kursi is remarkable, precisely because it is so consistent, yet adaptable. It can be read silently, or aloud, alone, or in a group, in a simple home, or a grand mosque. It travels easily, in memory, in manuscripts, in art, and in the quiet corners of daily life. Its power is subtle, flowing into hearts without force, offering reassurance, focus, and a sense of divine order. And as the night stretches on, it's easy to imagine all the moments across history when the verse was recited quietly, in tents under the stars, in classrooms lit by lanterns, in homes with families gathered together. Each recitation, gentle and deliberate, carried the same calm message that all creation rests in the care of one who never tires, never sleeps, and whose knowledge and authority extend over everything. As we arrive at the final stretch of this story, it's worth taking a deep, steady breath and letting your mind drift along the quiet currents of history. Ayat al-Kursi, from its first recitation in Medina to its presence across the vast Muslim world, has always been more than words on a page. It is a companion, a source of reassurance, and a gentle reminder of the order and authority that exists beyond human control. Across centuries, millions of people have whispered it, written it, decorated it, and reflected upon it. And in each act, the verse maintained its essence, calm, steady, and profoundly comforting. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the verse was firmly embedded in daily spiritual practice. Scholars continued to write commentary and tafsir, but everyday people, too, carried the verse with them. Families recited it before meals, before journeys, and especially before sleep. Travelers carried it in written form, tucked into leather pouches or sewn into clothing. Its words became part of a living rhythm, a subtle, constant presence in daily life. Mosques and schools across the Islamic world displayed the verse in art and architecture. Calligraphers transformed its letters into works of beauty, carving them into walls, painting them on tiles, and illuminating manuscripts with delicate gold. But even amid artistic splendor, the meaning remained central. It was not decoration alone, but a tool of reflection, remembrance, and comfort. Ayat al-Kursi also became central in spiritual practices, emphasizing protection and mindfulness. Reciting the verse before sleep, after prayer, or in times of uncertainty became an act of personal reflection, helping believers align their hearts with the awareness of divine oversight. This practice spread far and wide, from the deserts of Arabia to the cities of India, North Africa, and beyond. What is striking about Ayat al-Kursi is how it balances simplicity and depth. A child can memorize it easily, yet scholars can spend hours reflecting on its meaning. It bridges generations, regions, and cultures, uniting people in the shared experience of recitation and contemplation. Its impact is both subtle and profound, offering quiet reassurance in a world that is often noisy, chaotic, or uncertain. Even today, the verse continues to inspire. Millions of Muslims around the globe recite it daily. Some whisper it quietly before sleep. Others recite it aloud during prayer or in times of personal reflection. And in each recitation, the echo of centuries of devotion, scholarship, and cultural expression lingers. The verse has traveled across deserts, seas, and mountains. It has passed through countless hands, voices, and hearts. And through all this movement, it has remained unchanged, a calm, steady reminder of divine authority and protection. As we end this long journey together, it's worth closing your eyes for a moment and imagining all the silent nights across history, when Ayat al-Kursi was whispered softly, in homes by lantern light, in study circles under trees, in tents beside travelers, and in quiet corners of grand mosques. Each recitation carried reassurance, reflection, and the calm certainty of a presence that watches over everything. The verse is alive, not just in words, but in practice, art, scholarship, and memory. It links the past to the present and, in a subtle way, prepares the mind for the quiet acceptance of each moment. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let Ayat al-Kursi flow through your thoughts. Let its quiet authority remind you that, beyond human worry and distraction, there is order, knowledge, and protection. Let the rhythm of the verse settle your mind, and allow yourself to rest in the same calm that it has offered countless generations before you. And with that, the story of Ayat al-Kursi, its journey, its preservation, its influence, and its quiet power, comes gently to an end. But, like the verse itself, its presence continues, flowing softly across time, memory, and human hearts. Good night.